Yesterday, when I introduced Walter Donway, I mentioned having met him in college, and the reason I did was because his brother Roger was also in college at the time. He taught me at least as much philosophy as any of my professors, being a philosophy major and an objectivist. Roger had read Atlas Shrugged at a precocious age, still in school before he went to college, and went on to major in philosophy and has had a career of writing and editing. For 10 years, he worked for a small city newspaper, not so much a small city, it's Worcester, Massachusetts, the Worcester Telegram. Meanwhile, while he was writing about many of the local businesses, which I think may be the origin of his interest in the work he's done since on the business scandals and the laws that aim at businesses. He worked at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia and was the editor or managing editor of their quarterly publication, Orbis. And then in 1997, he came to work with us at what was then the Objectivist Center, or actually was the Institute for Objectivist Studies, and really created our magazine called Navigator. He still works with the Atlas Society as the managing director of our Business Rights Center, which has built on Roger's work and is an ongoing examination of legal cases, legal oppression of business people, such as Frank Quattrone and the many others that Roger has written about. And his articles are, if you are not familiar with the Business Rights Center, you should take a look at the site. Done just a wonderful job of standing up and aiming to get business people themselves to stand up for protecting their rights. Last year, he published Rich Hunt, the story of Greg Reyes, who was sued by the feds and ultimately spent time in prison for what essentially was, at best, an accounting irregularity from which profited none at all. And Greg was here last year to speak with us. Today, Roger is going to speak about his current project, which is taking the analysis of laws designed to hamper business. He's going to take it deeper and talk about the very concept of white-collar crime. And I think I can assure you in advance that you have never heard this before. So please, Roger.
Thank you, David. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The thesis of my talk today is simple. It's time to put an end to white-collar crime. By saying that, however, I don't mean we need more laws against white-collar crime, and I don't mean we need more prosecutors of white-collar crime. I mean that we need to abolish the term white-collar crime. You see, white-collar crime is not a rational concept. Despite its pretensions, it is not a concept that merely groups together certain types of illegalities. The term was created by two left-wing sociologists in the first half of the 20th century in order to impose on U.S. business a Christian morality, one that consisted of thou shalt nots and one that sought to humble worldly success. Today, the term survives in order to impose on U.S. business the anti-bourgeois sensibilities of postmodernism. That may seem like an odd evolution from Calvinism to postmodernism, but it is not. As Ayn Rand observed in her essay, What is Capitalism? The ethics of religious commandment and the ethics of personal whim do not differ that much when it comes to political practice. The one thing neither of them can abide is the pursuit of objective self-interest, as practiced in the free market. And that is exactly what the term white-collar crime seeks to crush. Now, I said that the term white-collar crime is not a rational concept. Why? The proof I offer is twofold. First, the examples people give of what constitutes white-collar crime are too heterogeneous to be rationally integrated. And second, consequently, no one has been able to give the term a rational definition. Let's look at the examples. If one goes to the FBI website, one finds the list of 60 white-collar crimes. For example, one finds combinations in restraint of trade and insider trading. Personally, I don't think those should be crimes, but they are clearly white-collar activities. So far, so good. But the FBI also lists ecology law violations. Presumably, that includes the woman who faced 25 years in prison for feeding whales. How is feeding whales a white-collar activity? The FBI also lists environmental law violations. I guess that includes the Michigan man they tried to put away for 5 years because he moved sand from one end of his cornfield to the other. Again, shifting sand in cornfields is not something I think of as white collar. In fact, the FBI includes welfare fraud, which seems the opposite of white collar. Maybe corporate welfare fraud. Other sources have other examples, but they are no less puzzling. For example, the Encyclopedia of White-Collar and Corporate Crime lists perjury, but perjury knows no class bounds. The encyclopedia also has an article on puffery, which it calls a form of deceptive advertising. That sounds promising as a white-collar crime, but here are 3 of their examples. Nestle makes the very best chocolate. Winston tastes good, like a cigarette should. And my favorite, Coke is the real thing. Ad writing may be white collar, but is that a crime? Okay, because the examples of so-called white collar crime are so disparate, there is no accepted definition of the term. In the book Understanding White Collar Crime by Professor of Law J. Kelly Strader, he says that prosecutors define white collar crime like this. This is an example for your Art of Reasoning next edition. First, it is a crime that does not involve using force against a person or property. Second, it does not directly relate to the possession or sale of narcotics. Third, it does not involve organized crime. Fourth, it does not relate to national policies such as immigration, civil rights, and national security. Fifth, it does not involve vice crimes. And sixth, it does not involve ordinary theft. As far as I can see, that would make a white-collar crime out of jaywalking. Other people have tried to come up with a positive definition of white-collar crime. For example, the Encyclopedia of White-Collar and Corporate Crime says the following. For the purposes of this encyclopedia, white-collar crime can be defined as any behavior that occurs in a corporate and/or individual occupational context, and that is committed for personal and/or corporate gain, and/or violates the trust associated with that individual's and/or corporation's position and/or status, and it is a violation of any criminal law, civil law, administrative law, rule, ruling, norm, or regulation condemning the behavior. If I followed that, a person commits a white-collar crime if he accepts money from a coworker to put a whoopee cushion under the boss's chair. Finally, then, a person seeking a definition of white-collar crime might turn to the National White-Collar Crimes Center. Surely, if anyone knows how to define white-collar crime, it will be the National White-Collar Crimes Center. And I am pleased to tell you, last year, after 20 years of existence, the National White-Collar Crimes Center launched a major project to define white-collar crime. I wouldn't hold my breath. Because the term white-collar crime is not rationally definable. It is a logically invalid concept. So where did it come from? Who created it, and why? The notion of white-collar crime, although not the exact term, had its birth in 1907 in an article written by sociology professor Edward Allsworth Ross. E.A. Ross, as he is called, was born in 1866 and grew up mostly in Iowa. From his era and his agricultural region, Ross absorbed the anti-industrial spirit of prairie populism and also a strict Presbyterianism. He received his A.B. from a small Iowa college where he continued to take religion very seriously, being either teacher or parishioner in 5 Sunday services each week. He would not be here. Ross did not lose his strict Protestantism until he undertook the then customary postgraduate trip to Bismarckian Germany. But all that Ross absorbed from the new German philosophy was despair. He learned that there was no God, no soul, no salvation. And he learned that evolution, rightly understood, had no direction and could offer no promise, contrary to Herbert Spencer's claims. Ross responded to these realizations by adopting the anti-intellectual attitude of pragmatism and fleeing back to a can-do America in order to take up an active life of law and reformist politics. But before Ross could begin such a political life, a friend urged him to seek out Richard Ely, a professor at Johns Hopkins who was the intellectual godfather of the progressive movement, and who was advocating economic theory as the best means of bringing about social reform. Ely's name is spelled E-L-Y, by the way. Ely had also studied in Germany and had obtained his PhD there, studying with members of the New Historical School. The message of this school was that social and economic institutions merely manifest their age, and society may therefore be reformed without any regard to any natural law, such as the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution espoused. This was just the message Ely and Ross were seeking. As for what changes Ely envisioned, his answers came from his religion. The mission of Christianity, he wrote, is to bring to pass here a kingdom of righteousness and to rescue from the evil one and redeem all our social institutions. To that end, Ely had helped form the Christian Social Union of the Episcopal Church in 1889, where he believed, quote, God works through the state in carrying out his purpose more universally than through any other institution. E.A. Ross, after getting his economics PhD under Ely, spent the next 16 years in a variety of teaching posts. But for the last 30 years of his career, he taught sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, then as now a haven for leftists. Post-Germany, of course, Ross rejected the metaphysics of religion and knew he could not justify religious morality, but that did not daunt his reformism. His object was to make individuals obey religious morality. There are, he said, unpleasant, slimy things lurking in the rear fens and undergrowth of the human soul. And his most famous book, Social Control, alleged that society possesses exactly 33 tools with which to tame those slimy things and bring men to what Ross called, quote, the social affirmation of Jesus. The essay by Ross that launched the idea of the white-collar criminal was published in the January 1907 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. The title of the essay and Ross's term for the white-collar criminal was the criminaloid. Ross wrote, by the criminaloid, we designate such as prosper by flagitious practices, which have not yet come under the effective ban of public opinion. Flagitious, I will tell you, means extremely wicked. Why does public opinion not fault those who prosper by extremely wicked practices? Only because such sins as violating the antitrust laws are too new. There has not yet been time enough to store up strong emotion about them, Ross wrote. And what motivates criminaloids? According to Ross, they want nothing more than we all want: money, power, consideration, in a word, success. But they are in a hurry, and they are not particular as to means. In short, businessmen are amoral and seek success in defiance of what Ross called the rules of the game. Throughout his essay, Ross fulminates against criminaloid practices such as offering dangerous jobs to workers, providing large customers with rebates, and selling inferior food. But he does not mention any criminaloid by name, and he cites no sources. So it is impossible to check the validity of his accusations. In his autobiography, Ross describes his essay as part of the muckraker movement, and he names 18 muckrakers whom he knew personally. Most likely, then, it was the highly unreliable work of the muckrakers that served as Ross's sources. In fact, using Google, I was able to track one of Ross's major anecdotes back to an article by his friend, the muckraker Lincoln Steffens. But connecting all Ross's accusations back to the muckrakers' articles and checking those articles against the truth will take a dissertation. At this point, all we can say is that the foundational essay of the whole white-collar crime movement was nothing but rhetoric. The second Ross essay, following up on his theory of the criminaloid, was called Sinning by Syndicate, and it appeared in the October 1907 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. This essay analyzed the corporate executive's special susceptibility to criminaloid behavior. Ross's argument was twofold. First, take the face-to-face element out of a relation, and any lurking devil in it comes to the surface. That is the true voice of prairie populism. Social and economic relations beyond the level of face-to-face relations are suspect. We hear the same voice in the criminaloid. The criminaloid prefers to prey on the anonymous public. Too squeamish and too prudent to practice treachery, brutality, and violence himself, he takes care to work through middlemen. The second part of Ross's argument has to do with the nature of the corporation, namely that it offers stockholders and directors the anonymity and distance that criminaloids desire, and so brings all the lurking devils into play. Quote, the moral character of the stockholder makes very little difference in the conduct of the affairs of the corporation. To the directors, their virtual mandate is get results. The directors pass this mandate to the officers pass it along to the heads of department, and these send it on down the line. Ross's two essays, joined by several more on the same subject, came out as a book in late 1907 with an introductory letter from President Theodore Roosevelt. The very apt title of the book was Sin and Society. This was the book that unleashed all the white-collar crime witch hunts that followed. But the man who actually coined the term white-collar crime was sociologist Edwin Sutherland. He was about 20 years younger than Ross, and so 30 years younger than the godfather of pragmatism, Richard Ely. There is no doubt, however, that Sutherland's term white-collar crime was derived from Ross's work, but Sutherland's first stab at it was white-collar criminaloid. Born in 1883 in Nebraska, Sutherland was, like Ross, a child of the prairie and the populist era. But Sutherland was raised in a far stricter religious home than Ross, one stricter even than the hideously strict religious home in which Richard Ely had grown up. The Sutherland children were punished harshly, and respect for authority was the only way to gain acceptance. A friendly biographer called the adult Sutherland compulsively virtuous. Sutherland received his A.B. in 1904 from Grand Island College, where his clergyman father was president. In 1906, he entered the University of Chicago, intent on studying history, but he was persuaded to switch to sociology and study with Charles Henderson, a Baptist minister turned sociologist. Henderson was another progressive who had studied in Bismarckian Germany and had picked up the anti-individualist theory of the state. Sutherland finished his degree in 1913 and took a job at William Jewell College, a Baptist institution in Missouri, where he held the chair of Christian socialism. After 6 years at William Jewell, Sutherland spent 7 years at the University of Illinois' sociology department, whose chairman, the editor of Lippincott's sociology books, asked Sutherland to write a criminology textbook for Lippincott, despite Sutherland's lack of background in the field. Sutherland did as he was asked, and the book, called Criminology, came out in 1924. Sutherland left Illinois in 1926 and muddled through a succession of appointments until arriving 9 years later at the two-man sociology department at the University of Indiana. Amazingly, just 4 years later, Sutherland was at the top of the sociology profession. In 1939, the third edition of his textbook was published, and he was considered the country's leading criminologist. In that year, too, Sutherland first set forth his own sweeping theory of sociology, which he grandly termed differential association, but which is basically a theory of omnipotent peer pressure. He was elected president of the American Sociological Society, and for his presidential address, he gave the talk that established his enduring fame, White-Collar Criminality. Sutherland's presidential address began by protesting that his only purpose in raising the topic of white-collar criminality was to set it up as a touchstone for theories of sociology. And in 1939, that may have been true. As I noted, 1939 was the year that Sutherland first stated his grand sociological theory that a person's behavior can be explained by what the people around him praise and do. So, if Sutherland wanted to disprove theories that said only poverty causes crime, an obvious way to do it would be by pointing out that a lot of wealthy people commit crimes. Sutherland begins by admitting that the statistics do show a greater incidence of crime among lower classes than the upper class, and that, he suggests, is why sociologists come up with their only poverty causes crime explanations. But the statistics are biased against the lower class, Sutherland insists, and therefore explanations of the only poverty causes crime type are unfounded. Unfortunately for Sutherland, he did have to concede an accurate statistical comparison of the crimes of the two classes is not available. Well, that is a big drawback. How can Sutherland prove white-collar crimes are undercounted without accurate statistics? What he does is to offer a sprinkling of anecdotes that he believes give a sense of the scale of white-collar crime in any given undertaking. For example, he offers the following anecdotes. Of the cans of ether sold to the Army in 1923-25, 70% were rejected because of impurities. In Indiana, during the summer of 1934, 40% of the ice cream samples tested in a routine manner by the Division of Public Health were in violation of law. Now, is that weird? Cans of ether sold to the Army 15 years ago? Ice cream tested in one U.S. state during one summer 5 years ago? Obviously, those cherry-picked anecdotes aren't even the beginning of an argument about the extent of white-collar crime. In fact, they don't seem to involve crime at all. All they prove is that somebody at some time set up some rules regarding ether and ice cream, and somebody else at some later time judged that somebody else at that later time had not conformed to those rules. Why is Sutherland using these anecdotes in connection with the term crime? Well, Sutherland addresses that. The crucial question in this analysis is the criterion of violation of the criminal law. True. If you are trying to get a handle on the extent of white-collar crime, then white-collar violations of the criminal law would be a good criterion. But no, not according to Sutherland. That is much too narrow. He wants to expand it in 4 ways. First, we must count as white-collar crime any adverse non-criminal rulings by regulatory agencies, such as the SEC. Failure to count these as crimes, Sutherland says, is the principal reason for the bias in statistics about crime between the upper and lower classes. In other words, the chief explanation for the apparent differences between the amount of lower-class crime and the amount of upper-class crime in the criminal statistics is that the upper-class crimes are not, for the most part, crimes. Second, according to Sutherland, when we total up the number of white-collar criminals, we must include not only convictions or adverse regulatory rulings, we must add in people who should have been convicted or received adverse regulatory rulings. So you are a white-collar criminal if a sociologist determines, apart from any verdict or regulatory finding in your favor, that you should have been found to have violated the law or regulation. Third, we must include as white-collar criminals people who are acquitted because of status or influence. Well, that might seem reasonable, but again, are sociologists in a position to make that judgment? And in any case, Sutherland wanted to go much further. Looking reasons, there may have been earlier cases in which people were let go because of status or influence. And those earlier cases may have established legal rules and precedents that allowed contemporary executives to be acquitted. So we must count you as a white-collar criminal if you have been acquitted because some procedure or precedent does not exist, because of someone's past status or influence, as determined by a sociologist, of course. Lastly, we must count anyone involved as an accessory to a white-collar crime, as described above, as being himself no less of a white-collar criminal. So let's pull this together. You are a white-collar criminal worthy of prison if you assist someone who is found innocent of committing any crime or regulatory violation if some anti-business sociologist thinks the person that you assisted would have been found guilty of a crime or regulatory violation, according to the sociologist's personal judgment about what procedures and precedents might now exist if people in the past had not been influenced by class or status. If you wonder why today's white-collar crime prosecutions have the atmosphere of a witch hunt, this is the explanation. Witch hunting was built into the term at its birth. 10 years later, Sutherland turned his most famous article into his most famous book, White-Collar Crime. In this work, Sutherland does define the term of his title, sort of. Quote, white-collar crime may be defined, approximately, as a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation. But to this he adds a footnote. The term white collar is used here to refer principally to business managers and executives. These two sentences demonstrate that Sutherland was no longer concerned principally with proving his sociological theory. For if he were still concerned principally to show that respectability is keeping upper-class people out of the crime statistic, why would he eliminate from his study doctors, clergymen, judges, and lawyers, soldiers and policemen, professors, and scientists? Now, 10 years later, after his celebrated address, Sutherland's anger had become directed against businessmen. It is them that he wants to see in prison, and of course today it is business that remains central to white-collar crime crusades. In his book, Sutherland doubled down on his assertion, which some had criticized, that the class of business criminals includes many more businessmen than have been convicted of crime. Sutherland says that certain critics have quibbled about his examples, quote, on the grounds that the rules of proof and evidence used in reaching many of these decisions were not the same as used in criminal courts. This involves especially the proof of criminal intent and the presumption of innocence. Sutherland insisted those limitations should not be applied. So being declared a white-collar criminal should require no criminal intent on your part, and you should receive no presumption of innocence in the case against you. And that is just for the actual criminal trial that can throw a person in jail. You can be publicly labeled and classified as a criminal by sociologists or journalists, even if you are nevertheless found innocent by a court or regulatory agency. If this is beginning to sound Kafkaesque, it is. Just how Kafkaesque Sutherland learned when he went to publish his book. The manuscript was accepted by a press where Sutherland was the sociology editor, but the publisher, understandably, feared to issue a work that libeled as criminal people who had not been convicted of crimes. So the names and cases were omitted, although Sutherland supplied legal references to those who inquired. In 1983, however, Yale University Press published the uncut edition of Sutherland's White-Collar Crime, with all the names and cases restored. Obviously, this presents an opportunity for a landmark dissertation about Sutherland's accuracy. Yet I cannot find that anyone, even after 30 years, has tackled the question. We may notice, however, that Sutherland dropped from his book those two anecdotes about ether and ice cream, even though he reprinted virtually word for word the paragraph that included them. That at least should be investigated. So, there is the story of how two left-wing sociologists created the term white-collar crime and the permanent witch hunt it generates. Their outlook, I hope I have shown, arises from a four-point argument, and I hope to show now that each of those points should be rejected. Their argument runs as follows. First, profit-seeking is a bad thing because it tempts people to violate social norms, such as regulations governing economic transactions. Second, corporations are especially bad things because they are pure profit-seeking institutions. Third, because we live in a corporate economy, the violation of regulations by business is rampant. Fourth, because this crime wave arises from the nature of profit-seeking and the nature of corporations, nothing will curb it but more regulations, more prosecutions, and harsher punishment. Well, I admit that is a coherent argument, but it's completely false, and it needs to be stomped into the ground, point by point. I would answer it as follows. First, profit-seeking, if it is objectively profitable, is a good thing when viewed from an egoistic perspective. If profit-seeking tempts a person to violate social norms, then that too is probably a good thing. Second, corporations are especially good things because profit-seeking is a good thing, and as our opponents say, corporations are nearly pure profit-seeking institutions. Third, because corporate profit-seeking is a good thing, it is unlikely to give rise to rampant criminal behavior. Apparent corporate crime waves are due largely to the over-criminalization of legitimate corporate behavior, and that over-criminalization needs to be exposed. Fourth, because corporate profit-seeking is a good thing, and apparent corporate crime waves are due to over-criminalization, we need to decriminalize most of what is now considered corporate misbehavior. In the meantime, we need to crusade for far milder punishments. By way of a conclusion, I shall go through these two four-point arguments, beginning with the arguments set forth by the white-collar crime witch hunters. First then, the term white-collar crime rests on the assumption that profit-seeking encourages the violation of norms. This assumption was natural to the term's creators because both grew up in the anti-business subculture of prairie populism, and both were raised in strict Protestant families, where morality meant ethical commandments and ritual observances, not personal self-realization. Ross remained strongly religious, at least until his post-college departure for Germany at age 22. Sutherland seems to have retained his Christianity until substantially later in his 20s. But in both cases, what the men dropped in their 20s was a belief in the metaphysics of Christianity. What they seem not to have dropped was the commandment orientation of their Protestantism. Ross rightly described his book as modernizing the message of the Old Testament prophets, and claimed that it had inspired tens of thousands of sermons. Well, if profit-seeking encourages law-breaking, as the theorists of white-collar crime argue, then corporations by their nature will tend to be law-breaking machines, for they exist only to make a profit. Ross made this argument at length in his article, Sinning by Syndicate. For Sutherland, it emerges from his theory that people learn wrongdoing from peers, and that people in business therefore learn it is permissible to act amorally for the sake of profit. Thus Sutherland writes, as part of the process of learning practical business, a young man with idealism and thoughtfulness for others is inducted into white-collar crime. He develops an ideology. This ideology, in part, is transmitted as a generalization by phrases such as, we are not in business for our health. Business is business, and no business was ever built on the Beatitudes. The deduction from these two premises is that law-breaking by corporate executives is vast, and the purpose of Sutherland's book was to demonstrate that. He examined the 70 largest corporations in the United States as of 1938 and added up the violations of law they had committed. The total came to 980, and the average was therefore set at 14. Since the average lifespan of these 70 corporations was 45 years, that implied a violation of law every 3 years for each corporation. Given what Sutherland counted as a violation of law, I don't consider that large, but obviously his readers did. His book became the silent spring of the white-collar crime movement. The final element of the white-collar crime argument was stated simply by Sutherland. White-collar crime is real crime. Yet businessmen who committed crimes, such as violating the antitrust laws, were not being criminally prosecuted, and few were being imprisoned. Ross attributed this to the public's failure to grasp the criminal nature of the behavior. Sutherland accepted that analysis, but added additional reasons, such as the substitution of regulatory agencies. Both men, though, saw an urgent need to stigmatize businessmen who violated the rules, establish more rules, criminally prosecute all rule breakers, and then give the rule breakers harsh prison sentences. Businessmen feared only one thing, Sutherland said, to be arrested by policemen, hauled before the criminal court, and convicted of crimes. Now, that is the white-collar crime fanatics' four-part argument, and it still constitutes the essence of the white-collar crime movement. But it needs to be refuted point by point. The result of such a refutation, I hope, will be the permanent destruction of the term white-collar crime. So here is how I would go about refuting the argument and destroying the term. First, they say that profit-seeking encourages violations of social norms and is therefore a bad thing. My response is profit-seeking, if it is objectively profitable, is a good thing when viewed from an egoistic perspective. If such profit-seeking tempts people to violate norms, well, that is probably a good thing too. For example, a society may have a norm against hiring blacks, but a profit-seeking businessman looking to hire the best or cheapest labor may decide that he would rather increase his profits than obey his society's norms. If it is good for the businessman and good for the person who gets the job, then no other estimate is relevant from an egoistic perspective. To illustrate how deeply the founders of the term white-collar crime disagreed with this egoistic perspective and how far they were prepared to go in enforcing this social perspective, I offer you this anecdote. In 1909, E.A. Ross addressed a rally in San Francisco during a time when organized labor was concerned that Japanese immigrants would lower Americans' wages. Ross suggested that the U.S. Navy should turn its guns on the boats carrying Japanese immigrants and sink them. That is a perfect example of what Isabel Patterson called the humanitarian with the guillotine. No wonder that Ross, like his friend Lincoln Steffens, endorsed the Bolshevik Revolution while acknowledging its bloody methods. He was himself a Leninist at heart. Okay, point two. If profit-seeking is presumptively a good thing, what does that tell us about the corporation? Precisely to the extent that the corporation is a pure engine of profit, it will tend to be even more virtuous than profit-seeking individuals. After all, an individual may choose to exercise a prejudice against blacks rather than make a little extra money by hiring one, but a corporation has checks and balances that tend to keep an employee from acting on personal prejudice. When I realized the whole Ross-Sutherland perspective on corporations needed to be inverted, I decided to investigate one of Sutherland's most damning anecdotes, which he used in his talk and repeated in his book. He wrote as follows: A.B. Stickney, a railroad president, said to 16 other railroad presidents in the home of J.P. Morgan, "I have the utmost respect for you gentlemen individually, but as railroad presidents, I wouldn't trust you with my watch." So there is the logic. Men who are honest in themselves will, in their capacity as corporate executives, behave no better than thieves. Ever since Sutherland set down that anecdote, it has been repeated endlessly. It appears in books on criminology and sociology, in books on big business and business ethics, in U.S. Senate testimony and House committee staff reports. Well, thanks to Google, I was able to track down the origins of the quotation. Its source is the December 16, 1890 edition of the Chicago Tribune. The news story shows first that Sutherland did not get the quotation quite right, but what is more important, he completely distorted the context. Ask yourself, why would 16 railroad presidents be meeting at J.P. Morgan's house? Obviously, they were trying to form a pool to keep their railroad rates up. Now, for reasons that go back to medieval law, it was legal in 1890 to form a pool, but governments would not enforce the contracts necessary to make the pool legally binding. So pools rested on nothing but the participants' word. What Stickney was saying in his own vivid way was just this: gentlemen, you are all honest men, but voluntary pools never work. And of course, he was right. Personally, I do not believe there is anything wrong with companies entering into a price-fixing agreement. But if the agreement begins to destroy one of the companies, then a responsible CEO is going to break the agreement. And I think that is a moral decision on his part. It's what he owes his company. So Stickney was simply stating a truth that libertarians have always proclaimed. Virtuous profit-seeking ensures that voluntary cartels never last. But in Sutherland's speech and in his book, that happy economic truth was transformed into the assertion, businessmen, just insofar as they are businessmen, are no better than thieves. Well, now that we've reversed our estimate of profit-seeking and of that profit-seeking engine called the corporation, obviously we will be suspicious of the claim that crime is a way of life in the business world. Business scandals may seem frequent, but the reason is that Ross and Sutherland and the white-collar crime movement unleashed a tidal wave of criminalization against business practices. At the time, Ross and Sutherland wrote, for example, insider trading was not a crime. Now the brilliant Raj Rajaratnam is condemned to spend the rest of his mortal life in prison. We urgently need to expose the blatantly innocent nature of these activities that white-collar crime prosecutors are attacking. And the Business Rights Center, I am pleased to say, is doing exactly that. But the final step of the white-collar crime argument, and the step we need to oppose most vigorously, is the assertion that white-collar crime must be greeted with greater criminalization, more prosecutions, more prison time. Fighting that, I believe, should be the truly crusading aspect of our opposition to white-collar crime persecutions. As we continue to demonstrate and publicize the innocuousness of what is now criminalized business behavior, we must demand ever milder punishments for those who are swept up in white-collar crime witch hunts. Above all, we must crusade unrelentingly against every attempt to imprison any person for essentially innocent behavior. And for the longer term, well, our goal must be decriminalize, decriminalize, decriminalize. Decriminalized until we get back to that bedrock of individual rights that the progressives persuaded 20th century America was mere prejudice. I understand, really, I do, that reasonable people will ask, if we fully decriminalize and deregulate the marketplace, how will ordinary people be able to avoid the business chicanery that certainly exists? Well, first, for true economic crime, such as larceny and embezzlement, there will, of course, be criminal punishment. But as for what will replace today's 10,000 regulatory commandments, I concede that I can only speculate. Several years ago, Professor Daniel Klein assembled a collection of essays showing how much has been and might be accomplished through the economic mechanism of reputation. And an essay in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, called The Assault on Integrity, made the same point. Perhaps that is the key. I find it very telling that the principal connotation of the term white-collar crime is precisely that reputation counts for nothing in the market. That has been the core belief of all the white-collar crime fanatics from their earliest days. That is the one thing they have insisted upon militantly. Perhaps it is because they have sensed that the economic role of reputation and integrity is the greatest alternative to their schemes. But in the end, I can offer no certainties. I cannot tell you what private mechanisms will replace public regulation. The answer requires a Hayekian process of social discovery, and that can take place only among a free people, which is exactly why we need to roll back the regulatory state. There is a socio-political law, I believe, that says only after government retreats from controlling people's lives can free people devise the private institutions needed to take the place of government control. So only after government abandons its obsession with white-collar crime can free people devise the private institutions needed to secure their ability to participate safely in free markets. Will there be hardships and misfortunes and injustices during the transition from government regulation to private regulation? Absolutely. Lots. I don't deny that. But I think of a scene at the end of Ira Levin's great novel, This Perfect Day. The hero, Chip, has just destroyed the omniscient computer, Uni, which has been micromanaging every aspect of people's life on Earth. Suddenly, Chip feels a flash of concern about the possible consequences of the freedom that he has unleashed on people who have no experience running their own lives. His companion responds, in effect, But think of all the tyranny that is no longer being inflicted on them. That is my perspective. After we roll back the regulatory state and before private institutions have fully taken its place, there will be hardships and misfortunes and injustice. But this much will also be true. We will no longer be putting our Michael Milkens through hell. We will no longer be putting our Frank Quattrones through hell. We will no longer be putting our Greg Rays through hell. And whatever hardships, whatever misfortunes, whatever injustices we must endure for a while in order to achieve that end, they will be well worth it. Thank you.
I'm not sure if I can frame this, but when the semantic is to get rid of white-collar crime, it creates a little bit of the same legacy problem in my mind that we've had with selfishness and that term and properly defining it. Would we be better off trying to accept that there's a common use of that term, properly define, and I understand that you say it hasn't been defined, but properly define the term to mean, a violation of force or fraud in, what I'll call corporate organizations, whether those are for-profit, non-profit, whatever, properly define the standards, because the sale of, we're going to get rid of white-collar crime, we're going to decriminalize it, and then rebuild it from there, just that part is to me not only a tough sell, but also sort of a apologist for people who commit genuine crime.
Classification, white collar. It's a class term. Any genuine economic crime, fraud, embezzlement, larceny, whatever classification we come up with, say occupational crime, corporate crime, it shouldn't be done in class terms. I think I offered the analogy at one point. Even if we could show sociologically that the overwhelming amount of gang crime in our cities and drug crime was carried out by Hispanics, we wouldn't have a Hispanic crime task force. I mean, I'm not trying to tell the sociologists that, don't find out who's doing it. Fine, but we wouldn't have a legal term that is based on sex or race or class. It seems to me that is going in the direction of postmodernism. We can call it corporate crime, we can call it occupational crime, stuff like that. So
if we called it corporate crime, as a standard, because in fact, legally we've created these entities, so it's anything that happens on that side, to replace the term white-collar crime, to have something that allows that clarity is, I guess, my point. Because I think when selling this as decriminalize, get rid of this, that strikes me as a very, very hard sell.
Well, I think the genuine economic crime, will still be there. There's still crimes like embezzlement.
Right.
Still crime of larceny. If you want to have a category, embezzlement, larceny committed in an occupational or corporate context, mouthful, but using a postmodern term like class, race, sex, the wrong way to go.
Understand.
What has been done to broadcast or to have your articles published in many business magazines, trade journals, etc.?
Yeah, well, I haven't actually written, something. I'd have to see where I'm trying to target it and write something, that would fit that,
yes.
that venue. And I think it would be good to make the point that Jay was making, that not denying that there's business chicanery, what I call business chicanery. It's that this is a this is a postmodernist class term. That's bad. Bad. You need to not think of each other in terms of class, race, sex. But I don't know. I would have to think of a venue. If you would care to pass the venue along.
Anyway, I
Suggest
just,
a venue.
yeah, my question, I guess, is how do we get the word out, So,
Well, this has been recorded, right?
yes.
That's one. All right.
Yes, I wanted to say something about the demonization of profit. Economic profit is merely a subcase of a more general principle of profit. It's really profit that makes life possible. A plant doesn't send down a taproot unless it expects to get profit in the form of water. A lion doesn't run down a gazelle unless it expects to get profit in the form of enough calories. And it's really profit that is that little bit of extra effort that compensates for the second law of thermodynamics. So it's really profit that makes life of any kind possible.
Right. Well, I was saying that when the white-collar crime people say, well, people want profit, they're prepared to do anything to get it. The answer is, if it's really profit, from an egoistic perspective, that's got to be good. Say, I'll do anything for profit. Okay, commit suicide. Doesn't make any sense. If you're violating the rules, which, in an egoistic perspective, are only there to help you profit, than to say, you'll act immorally in order to profit, really, from an egoistic perspective, is almost self-contradictory. Yes, it is.
Since you were asking for venues, the first thought that occurred to me as you were talking was whether this could be marketed not just to businessmen, but to atheists, given the history of where the white-collar crime term comes from. There's a lot of atheist magazines out there now that publish good quality work. And I'd be curious how that would be received, but just a thought. My question is, it's true that a lot of ethicists, sociologists, people along that line of the humanities do not hold much of an egoist standard and have viewed that negatively, but a lot of economists do implicitly hold a positive view of egoism, especially in the economic realm. And I wonder if any of them, over the years, what economists have said about this class, whether it's been challenged, if you have any examples or anything that has come up.
Ross got his PhD in economics, but shifted to sociology. Of course, at the time, economics was not as well developed as it has been. They didn't have the whole influence of the Chicago School and all that. I have certainly found, a lot of help in putting this paper together from the free market economists.
Okay.
I don't know of any free market sociologists or individualist sociologists. I suppose there must be some. But, the economists are much more, I think, on our side. The journalists, the sociologists.
What about the non-explicitly free market-oriented economists, just the economic profession, whether there's been any substantial addressing of this issue?
One thing that I know, and I actually learned it from Roger, is years ago, in the early 90s, after the so-called decade of greed, a number of people were, when the press and the prosecutors were demonizing hostile takeovers and so-called junk bonds, highly leveraged transactions, and which resulted in Michael Milken going to prison. There were people studying those and saying, these buyouts, many of them anyway, and especially the ones that Michael Milken oversaw, actually created wealth and released capital into markets and more productive uses. So there is a literature on the subject. However, let me just say one word also in answer to your question, John. Our website is a primary publishing vehicle for Roger's work and the work of everyone on the staff. And we've, as you heard Aaron say, we are rapidly increasing its visibility and the traffic and the number of people who are consuming it. But Roger, his book, Rich On, also got a very nice review from a prominent economist, David Henderson, in, where is that published? In Regulation?
Cato's Regulation.
So, we are getting the word out that way, but we need to. Your point is very well taken. There's much more to do on that front. All right, folks, I need to make just a couple of announcements before we wrap. Thank you, Roger, for a fabulous talk.